It's not even a soft science anymore, right?
Hello, hello. Testing, testing. Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started in just a minute here. I wanted to make a few announcements first. Have people ready? Go ahead and get yourself settled. First off, there's food and coffee up there. People should really feel free to help themselves. Just jump on in as you like. But welcome to the first annual Platypus Southern Regional Conference. Hopefully there'll be many more, but we're very excited. We have a full day of, I think, very interesting discussion. I wanted to say some things just about kind of general procedure and stuff like that. First off, we're going to have 3 panels throughout the day. As you can see, we're going to have the first panel, political parties in the left, starting after I do these announcements. It's going to go till about 2. There's going to be a break between 2 and 3. And then at 3, we're going to do family in the left. And then at 5, we're going to do the final panel, which is going to be What is Marxism For? I highly encourage everybody to stick around for the whole day. I think it's, like I said, going to be very interesting, very thought-provoking. One of the things that we really like to do is encourage audience participation. I'll let Max and the other panel moderators kind of explain the format, but really encourage everybody to kind of come up with questions and thoughts and ideas to share. We will be recording this over Zoom, so just FYI, just for people's info. Other things to know, so we do have gender-neutral and handicap-accessible restrooms on the 4th and 5th floor of this building. Okay, you can take the elevators that are right around the corner, or you can take the stairs, whatever's preferable. There are, of course, bathrooms outside. There are water fountains all around, so do whatever you need to, of course. I want to say thank you, of course, to all our panelists. I want to say thank you to the Party for Socialism and Liberation, for the Communist Party USA, definitely we'll have other people speaking today. And a very, very special thanks to Eli and Chris, who are our audiovisual geniuses. Yes, they're totally volunteering their services, so thank you so much, guys. Saved the day. So just a few things that I wanted to announce. Of course, so Platypus is an international organization, but we have a chapter here at UT, if people aren't aware. Really encourage people to come and participate if they'd like. All of our events are free. We do not require membership. So we have a reading group Sundays from 2 to 5 in this building, in Burdine 128, just down the hall. We also have a social hour every Thursday at 7 p.m. in the Union Underground. So come and check us out if you're interested in this discussion. The other thing we would ask is, there were some costs that were associated with this event. We want people to come, so, we're not asking for any sort of required payment, but if you felt generous and you felt like donating to defray some of those costs, and maybe we could throw some money at our audiovisual guys who came a long way, that would be really awesome. Our Venmo is at Platypus Austin. So, let's see, am I forgetting anything? I think that's about it. All right, let's get the show on the road.
Howdy, everybody.
Hi.
Ooh, okay. So I'll just give a quick elevator pitch here. The Platypus Affiliate Society, established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, such as this, research and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 1930s, new and post-political left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. The Austin chapter has been meeting since 2017. We hold a weekly social hour at 7 p.m. in the Union Underground, a reading group 2 and 5, from 2 to 5 on Sunday. And the description for this panel is political parties and the left. The left has, for over a generation, for over 40 years since the crisis of 1973, placed its hopes in the Democratic and Labor parties to reverse or slow neoliberal capitalism, the move for transnational trade agreements, the movement of capital and labor, and austerity. The post-2008 crisis of neoliberalism, despite phenomena such as SYRIZA, Occupy Wall Street, the Arab Spring and anti-austerity protests more generally, Bernie Sanders' candidacy and Jeremy Corbyn's Labour leadership, has found expression on the avowed right through UKIP, Brexit, and the UK Conservatives' move to red Toryism and Donald Trump's election. The old neoliberal consensus is falling apart, and change is palpably in the air. Margaret Thatcher's infamous dictum, "there is no alternative," has been proven wrong. What can the left do to advance the struggle for socialism under such circumstances? Recent generations of marginalized radicals have been forced to grapple with an impossible choice. They must either submit to a realistic electoral compromise with the status quo, often in the form of lesser evilism, or they must vote for a third-party candidate, hoping that by making their platform public, the winning party could be pushed leftward. Alternatively, out of exhaustion with this impasse, they may choose not to vote, advocating instead a principled abstention from electoral politics. What lessons can the left draw from the history of mass electoral parties for socialism to create more emancipatory choices in the future? How do we reimagine the role of electoral campaigns for leftist politics today? Given that a significant number of working people in America have left the Democratic Party, what is possible? And to introduce our panelists here, Michael Woodson in the middle teaches English and Humanities for Lee College in Baytown, Texas. He produces and hosts an art radio program on Pacifica's Houston station, KPFT. He has been on the boards of Pacifica, KPFT, Voices Breaking Boundaries, and the Arts Rescue Mission. He was active and sometimes organizer of Anti-Iraq War, School of the Americas, End Mass Incarceration, Food Not Bombs, Occupy, BLM, and other activist initiatives. I'll pull up Pete's on here real quick. Pete Rosky is a middle-aged man living in Texas by way of New Jersey. His words, not mine. It wasn't until moving to Texas that he realized just how impossible neoliberal government made it for people of all stripes, some worse than others, to live a decent life. After much study and conversation with peers, he decided that the immortal science of socialism was the only thing that could save the United States of America. And finally, Brianna Griffith. Brianna Griffith is an independent journalist and organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation. She was the host of the radio program People's Republic from 2017 to 2021 and covers issues related to Texas, Latin America, and labor for Liberation News. She served as the program director for the 2022 Texas Eco-Socialism Conference. Now, our format is roughly as follows. We're going to give each person a 10-minute opening statement, allow 2 minutes for responses to one another's opening statement, then we're going to open up the floor to questions. Let me just pull up a stopwatch here. All right, Pete, we'll start with you.
Great. So, hi, everybody. As I said, I'm a middle-aged guy who recently joined the Communist Party of the United States here in Austin, and I'm learning a lot about different ways to kind of functionally participate in the electoral United States politic. And I, like everyone else, have seen the struggles that were mentioned in the elevator pitch. And I think that in this panel, hopefully, we're going to discuss some attempts, some good, some bad, some failed, some accomplished, at both working within and maybe working without current neoliberal electoral politics throughout the globe, whether it's in Europe, Latin America. Really, those are our hot spots. There are some great African countries like Kenya that are really stepping up their activity as well. And I think there's a lot we can learn from all of those. So my intent, hopefully, is to bring some classic Marxist ideas, whether it's from Marx himself, Engels, Lenin, even Stalin, on how to use and participate in the electoral process as a communist without just being a reactionary, revolutionary. So I think those are things that we can hopefully hit on here, and I look forward to conversing with my comrades. I don't know I had 10 minutes, but
Brevity's a
good, yeah. Let's have the conversation.
Michael?
Cool. All right. So besides the civil society efforts I talked that was mentioned, I was mindful to just mention that I have worked with the Green Party, and I have worked with the CPUSA. I actually was in a room with Bob Avakian with the RCP, and I think those are political parties. And also back in the 90s, I was a campaign manager for a Republican. That's a long story. But he was a friend, and I was a school teacher. So I've seen political parties. I'm not sure that that's actually what we're we could discuss whether or not that really related to this panel, whether those are the kinds of parties the left recognizes, the true left or critical left would recognize as party. But anyway, let me just read this, please. 2 nights ago, I asked my son, who is a senior at U of H, and he's sort of a self-avowed socialist, what his generation felt about political parties and the left In a word, he said, frustrated, no good jobs, no prospect to buy a house or move out on his own, college debt, inflation, global warming, war on terror, war in Ukraine, police brutality, hate crimes. He was ready to talk about it and quite capable of talking about it. He was pretty sure his generation was going to get a raw deal, and that his time might be the worst of times. And 2 nights ago, Mark Levin, a constitutionalist Republican talk show host, very conservative, gave brief thoughts over a fellow conservative talk show host who had died that day. He reminded his audience that maybe through history 1,000 people are remembered for longer than 3 generations. We are dust, and to dust we will return. So carpe diem, God, family, friends, because outside that, all is oblivion on this planet. Both of these stories beg the same question. What's the point of life? In both cases, the expressions were pretty bleak, pretty limited. We will never make the grade, and there's no good reason why we'll never make it. That's what political parties are for. Humans are a political species. That's what Aristotle said, too. In modernity, and let's just say as recent, at least since 1848, at least since the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights, we are a species in equality that has a planet-wide right to bitch about how things are. We are the species free to complain. But what are political parties for the left? So let's organize this by 2, history and politics. I don't know which to talk about first. The crisis of the left in politics is ignorance of Marxist theory, but in reality, everything is politics. If Marx is obsolete, let's say like the philosopher Boethius is obsolete, then there is no history to the left, it's just stuff that's happening. And that's what Homer Simpson said at the end of one of his episodes way back when. He said, this episode, he said, there's no moral to it. It's just, my best Homer Simpson, it's just a lot of stuff that happened. You know? So I teach stories. A story has action. Action is stuff that happens, just stuff that happens. A literary story might, almost always, has a plot. Plot links action. Plot is the reason things happen, the cause, the effect. I'd say history and politics is the plot to stories, to humanity, to us. Without both history and politics, life is just a lot of stuff that happens. Today, since the 1960s, especially since the 73 turn to neoliberalism, history is the missing element of left politics. Everything is urgent, everything is so now. We accept the proposition that things are screwed up and that we are the immediate agents of that, and we are, the left, the purveyors of justice and equality. And why? Because we're the good guys, because we have good hearts. We are conscious of our exploitation and oppression and want it to stop for us, for others, and for the future. But I do not feel that we take into account what we're up against, the social forces that dominate us. I don't think we consider what it means that we are up against ourselves, that we are not to the side of capitalism. We ourselves, even our driving virtues, are perpetuating the crisis within the complaints that we make for change. My son believes with his whole heart that all we can do is push the Democrats to the left until one day we have socialism. A better world will happen. Gradualism. Change one step at a time, but there's nothing complete about that faraway time, and worse, that faraway time has to do with an organized world, that's just about survival. It lacks the central question of purpose and the ambiguity of freedom, and it's a whole different discussion. but I wish I could stop and say more about that. Anyway, it's limited and necessarily so currently. What we are up against convinces me that we do not know what we are up against. We belong to the order of things. Our epoch is one of relations of equality. We feel and make a claim to the modern notion of we the people. This modern age embraces that in word and legalities. And this order involves all the forces of general wealth, the military being one of them, but also the school system, the financial industry, the cultural industry, government, police force, just resources, right? That's what we're up against. And as self-operational and automatic as these forces seem, they plan. The Pentagon, for example, accounts for history, for the way wars went and go in making its war plans. We, or our agents, if you like, we make plans. We have theories. We learn from how things were to anticipate how things will go. It's not theory. It's called learning. The White House, the Raytheon, the Pentagon, Amazon, Disney, they are theory and practice, if only theory and practice in growing and managing by crisis, and we are them. Is the left aware of what it learns? Does it follow a history by which to learn? Does it understand, like the Pentagon does, its own history of revolution, counter-revolution? These are key terms for Marxism and Platypus I'm reading. Opportunism, playing politics against politics, regression. Do we know that socialism came with capitalism? Do we know we thought that anarchism was put to rest over 100 years ago? Do we know the division of the socialist movement vis-a-vis the workers' movement, two different things? Do we know Bonapartism and how it is a tool to understanding the dictatorship of the proletariat? Do we know we lost in 1848, 1871, 1917, and the valuable lessons of those losses? Is the concept of the proletariat even alive? Now, all of these platypus key terms may amount to only platitudes. We may be wrong, but what stands in the stead of this history? Do we know what we are up against in trying to take down the man? More and more I come up with the answer, it's politics. It's on my mind. Politics sums up the subjective and the objective for me, the individual that I feel I am and the world out there that I am against or is against me. I do not feel any agency, I don't feel competent, I don't think any of us do, to control the big problems like war, global warming, poverty, racism, sexism, violence, hate, like there's just no way to it except piecemeal. Politics seems to join the objective and the subjective. It is where I join with like-minded eyes. Politics is the wedge of the subject and the object into the flesh and bones of human existence, because those issues matter. Without politics, capitalism, or whatever we want to call it in this age we live in, it all seems like fate, just a lot of stuff that happens. Without a leftist history that we have learned from our mistakes for sure, a better world amounts to wishful thinking with a measure maybe of a little less suffering. The Platypus 19 Project has a proposition that 1960s tried to remember the 1930s in the recent memory of Lenin and Russia's attempt to change the world order by proletarian politics. 1917, Platypus Associated, 1917. 1917 is a failure to mark a spot for us. It calls us to act, but it does call us to ask, what is the proletariat as an historical question? That is the picture puzzle. I think that's Adorno's image.
We're running up at 11 minutes right now.
Can I finish? I'm just 2 minutes.
You can have some of mine. Yeah, it's okay.
I knew that was going to happen. I knew that was going to happen.
You get some of mine, Michael.
Yeah, see, I should have learned.
I'm
from
sorry, this is my
planning.
one job. I gotta really.
Okay, we good? Okay, I'll be quick. So I planned this little interruption. That is the picture puzzle, which is that kind of find the alligator in the jungle cartoon puzzle. That's, yeah. The proletariat, find the proletariat. That's the thing today. And should we even do that? Should left politics be in the effort of finding the proletariat, as Marx was trying to identify and clarify that historically new class in 1848 forward? His politics critiquing everything, the socialist and workers' movements, political economy, German idealism, all these things that Marx pinpointed, democracy, during the years of the Communist Manifesto, then 10 years later with the workers' movement, then 10 years after that with the Paris Commune. All of that happening in his life showed that he knew when politics was on fire for the left, what was possible, and what waiting and preparing means. And in conclusion, with all my leadership and activism, I spoke about at the top of this, that was part of the introduction, I never grabbed the bullhorn, and I always wondered why. Never grabbed the bullhorn at a rally because I didn't agree. I didn't agree with the commitment to any of the stuff that I'd seen, really. Just fell short. I was behind the scenes, silent leader. Now I'm a member of Platypus. Chris Catrone, the chief pedagogue and founder, he names his website The Last Marxist. I hope he's wrong about that, unless we mean last in the way we mean recent, like he was the last one to run a 3-minute mile. Maybe it means that, the last like that, or that it means Marx lasts. Marx and Marxism lasts.
And Brianna, it is your time to shine.
All right. Yeah, so I'm primarily a writer, so I'm going to be reading at people for a little bit. I got 3 pages, and yeah, it'll be good. So yeah, thank you so much for having me. Thanks to all the other organizers who are a part of this panel and who are part of this conference today. I want to answer the questions in pretty basic terms, and then I think we need to elaborate on like what a broad path forward really looks like. So first, the primary question is this. People's movements have risen up to challenge austerity across the world. The liberal capitalist center has been thoroughly discredited. The capitalist far right has co-opted parts of these struggles with pseudo-populist language, but there is still a large popular desire and continued uprisings for a better system. So as socialists, what tasks do we undertake to make gains in this climate? Some of this requires a little basic rundown of just organizing fundamentals to how to reach people. We need to be thinking about messaging, about what organized outreach looks like and continuous outreach looks like. I mean, how do you make a change if you're not knocking on a bunch of doors, just at a very fundamental level? What forms of struggle we want to engage in, how we engage in those, how to take on campaigns for reforms that actually strengthen rather than water down our revolutionary principles. So if we really want to challenge the far right, we need to be willing to engage in just the fundamentals of organizing on that. The next question, what lessons can we draw from mass electoral parties for socialism to create more emancipatory choices? So I think it's important that we understand that the capitalist state will never allow itself to be overturned or to be reformed away through an electoral path. Our political system, it is a bourgeois democracy, it is a capitalist democracy, which means that the ruling class reserves democracy for themselves and dictatorship for the workers. And if you don't believe that, call the cops on your landlord and tell them your landlord is violating your tenant rights and see who winds up being taken away in handcuffs. Then you'll determine who controls a dictatorship. Your landlord, your boss, etc. get to decide democratically amongst themselves how to rule society, and they impose a dictatorship on you. So that's, fundamentally, that's the root of our system. That all being said, running electoral campaigns, participating in the system is one tool in our organizing toolbox, but we have to understand what that tool can do and what that tool can't do. So last year, I volunteered to do outreach for the Kathy Rojas campaign, which challenged Eric Adams for the mayoral race in New York City. We had comrades on subways, we had comrades in parks and on street corners in every borough, spreading a basic message: tax the rich, jobs and quality housing for all, defund the police and police brutality, and end police brutality. There were more campaign points, but these are the only three you can really bark at people at a subway, over and over 1,000 times. So what was the goal of this campaign? Obviously, we weren't expecting to win the race, but from the vantage point of building socialist organizing, there were some major successes. First of all, we gained new insights. We learned that 28,000 people, or 1 out of every 40 people who voted, broke completely from the capitalist mainstream. They broke from Eric Adams. They broke from whatever the other guy's name was, and they voted for an explicitly socialist platform. Second, we trained up countless comrades across the country. We brought in comrades from all the way from LA and from the West Coast to this campaign in New York City. We trained up comrades across the country on how to present socialism to a mass audience. Third, we developed more connections within sectors of the working class, which helps us better gauge the consciousness and militancy level of the working class. Fourth, we were able to popularize a message about defunding the police and using that money for housing and jobs, etc., at a time when the capitalist media was doing everything in their power to discredit the defund the police movement. We used the campaign to intervene in key political conversations and to expand what working class people expect out of politics. So running campaigns is not just a matter of giving people a protest vote. You're not just trying to get to the 5%. You're not just trying to give people a way to say neither this nor that. It's not a protest vote. If you know how to use a campaign as a tool, you can get real tangible results. Now, I want to get at a question that I think is important and related to all of this, which is, given all this, given that we can't win electorally, why do we need a revolutionary socialist party? Why is this particular form of organizing important to advancing a working class agenda? So fundamentally, a party is an organization of people with a shared political interest who work together to advance the interests of their class or their group within that class. For a capitalist party, since they represent the class that is already in power, they don't have a lot of work to do. Their job is to maintain that power, to keep the status quo stable, to tinker around the edges of capitalism and imperialism and manage its contradictions. So naturally, capitalists would see electoral campaigns, which they largely control in the US, as the only legitimate, quote unquote, avenue of struggle, of political struggle. For a working class party, our goal is the opposite. Since we represent the exploited and the oppressed, our goal is to turn this system on its head. Any outcome that leaves the dictatorship of capital in place is only a temporary victory, and those gains will be eaten away either by inflation, which is itself a form of class warfare, or by state intervention when the working class movement begins to shrink. So for our goal, for a revolution that upends the current system, we need to function differently, we need to structure ourselves differently, to go into new arenas of struggle, and to engage in struggle everywhere that oppression breeds resistance. First of all, at its very base, a socialist party brings together the experiences of the working class and the oppressed into a collective whole. It makes those hard-earned lessons of struggle a common body of knowledge amongst the class. So over the past couple decades, we have seen major eruptions in struggles for feminism, LGBTQ liberation, Black and Indigenous liberation, disability rights, and of course in unionization. These are these embryonic forms of resistance, powerful but embryonic forms of resistance to oppression, but they have truly shaken the foundations of capitalism to its core. But by themselves, no single movement has been enough to overturn the system. Capitalism relies on keeping oppressed people alienated from each other, on divide and conquer strategies, so the immediate task of a socialist party is to bring these groups together into common cause. Alongside this, we also build a working class knowledge, collective knowledge of history, of political and economic theory. So why do we study this? We study this because the capitalist state learns from its successes and its mistakes, and the capitalist state adjusts its tactics accordingly in their forms of class warfare against the poor, against the workers. If we want to counter that, we need to build our own collective memory of struggle in the same way. Capitalist education is never going to teach us these historical lessons. By its very nature, it can't do that. So we need our own institutions, such as the Socialist Party, to build that consciousness, not just on current struggles, but on historical successes and failures, and advance simple economic and social consciousness into more advanced socialist ideas of how society should work. So now we have two basic functions of the Socialist Party: to collectivize the experiences of the struggle in our class, and to learn from past experiences and develop our theoretical, historical understanding of our struggles. Drawing from these two bodies of knowledge, we develop a platform of, dare I say it, socialism and liberation. That is to say, socialism being the economic liberation of the workers from exploitation, and liberation being the liberation of oppressed people from all of the forms of super exploitation and oppression that capitalism relies on to maintain class rule. So we don't just say the existing system is bad. We formulate a better system that takes the experiences of all those sectors of our class into account. Of course, as we advance the struggle, the capitalist state also goes on the counteroffensive. They have all sorts of tools at their disposal as well. The most powerful weapons they have, they certainly use violence. They do it every day against people who fight back. The most powerful weapons they have are the ones that are actually ideological. They ridicule, they discredit, they sow disinformation, they co-opt, they misdirect to divide and conquer sectors of the working class. A working class party needs to be able to weather all of these threats, to pivot quickly from one threat to another threat, and to counter ruling class propaganda in all of these veins while continuing to make new political interventions. We have to fight this, but we can't let it bog us down. Finally, we need to be able to respond to revolutionary crises. The capitalist system is built on contradictions that it can never truly resolve without creating other, more intense contradictions. It can postpone these crises. It can misdirect these crises or diffuse them or confuse them. It can buy itself time, but you cannot build a system of extreme wealth for a handful of people at one end and extreme poverty for billions of people at the other end and expect that system to remain stable for very long. These contradictions happen and they keep bubbling up. We are facing capitalist crises of ever greater intensity every day. Economic collapse, the failure of our healthcare system, massive debt crises, climate change catastrophes, and the changing nature of work are leading more and more people to correctly believe that this system is entirely illegitimate. The rebellions of tens of millions of people against racism and police violence just 2 years ago in 2020 shook the state to its core. But these moments where revolution is possible often appear and vanish in only a few days or a few weeks' time. And so this is what many of the recent uprisings that were cited at the beginning of this have lacked. The conditions for revolution are appearing more and more frequently. But without a strong, organized, and disciplined left that is able to navigate the treacherous waters of these crises and emerge victorious, the ruling class will have a chance to regroup and reestablish itself and find a different form of capitalist rule that keeps the system afloat. So Vladimir Lenin identified 3 conditions that are necessary for a revolutionary crisis. First, it is impossible for the ruling classes to maintain their current form of rule, and they become divided among themselves. Second, the suffering of the working class grows more acute than usual. And third, because of the previous 2 conditions, there's an increase in the activity of the people, a rebellion or just a general upsurge of militant activity. American capitalism is rapidly becoming discredited and is creating the conditions for its own demise. But revolutionary crises aren't a permanent fixture, and they aren't guaranteed to end in our success. The working class in rebellion provides the energy needed to uproot the system, but it is the Socialist Party that provides the finesse, the discipline, the expertise, the depth of theory, the depth of understanding, and the unity of oppressed people to see the revolution through to its end. That is the task at hand if we want to be rid of capitalist exploitation once and for all and to save our planet from the brink of destruction. A better world is possible, but we need to be willing to fight like hell for it. Thank you.
All right. So now, each of you is going to have 2 minutes to respond to the remarks of the other panelists, just going in the same order, starting with Pete and with Brianna. And after that, we will open the floor to questions. So, Pete, if you would like to begin.
Cool. I apologize for not preparing my opening remarks as well as y'all did. You probably have less to go on than I did. But I did want to talk a little bit about a few topics that were brought up. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about the concept of the proletariat possibly being extinct or non-existent that Michael brought up. I think that's fascinating because I think that concept of a non-existent proletariat really stems from individualism and a lack of unity found in peoples. There is a proletariat. There's a large one. All of us, most of us, are out there working a job we probably don't really like. We're probably not making enough money to survive besides paycheck to paycheck. We probably have needs that are not being met in this society, but we're not all unified by a vanguard party to come together as an actual proletariat and take action. And I think that's a really important thing to remember when questioning the concept of proletariat, when questioning the concept of a mass movement being available. I don't think that it's a matter of it not existing. I think it's more of a matter of it not being represented well and there not being a connective tissue for all of us struggling in this current neoliberal capitalist society. I'd also like to bring up the idea of without politics, stuff just happens. I think that's really fascinating. I don't really have anything to contradict it. I just think it's interesting that we currently live in a system that stuff is happening despite us and to us, but at the same time it is still happening, right? It's just happening. Whereas I think with a dictatorship of the proletariat, a proper, at least socialist, if not communist movement, you will see things happening not just for the sake of happening. And I think that's an important lesson for us all to remember as well, is that just because things are happening to us and around us doesn't mean that that's the way it is and that's the way it's going to be. And I think that's a lot of the issue with our current left defeatist attitude in a lot of areas where, and I'm not calling you out, just gonna quote something Bree said, obviously not expecting to win. I get pragmatism, I do, and I hear you, and you're absolutely right that was the right thought process to go in with. But I feel like we've been beaten down by capitalism to almost go in initially in any revolutionary act, accepting defeat before we fought. And I think occasionally it might be good for us to strengthen our resolve, go into something as crazy as it might be, as impossible as it might seem, and just go in looking to win. Take the L if you have to, but don't accept it the minute you start. Really come together, plan, which is huge. That is a very important factor in all of this. Come together, formulate a plan, understand each other's needs, the needs of the proletariat at large, and ultimately we might be able to fight these battles on a better footing than we currently are, which I agree, it's pragmatic, you're not wrong, but it's a disappointing thing I struggle with internally every day, is that defeatist attitude. Well, what is this gonna do? Well, let's list those things out. What is this gonna do? And I'm sure if you actually take a minute to think about it and properly plan, work with your comrades, you will see that you will get results, as Bree did mention.
I think we're going a bit over time here. Don't worry, we're gonna
Great.
have a bunch of
Great.
Michael, if you'd like to go ahead.
Yeah, as I mentioned, the parties that I have personally experienced, I guess when I said, that may not relate at all to this panel, it would be something that comes up a lot in Platypus, which is like an answer that's a cul-de-sac or something. Like, there is no party to turn to. So, when you have the issues that the Gen Z does, and you don't have a viable or believable, you're taking on the nuclear weapons, if you're talking about changing the world, right? You're taking on the Pentagon, you're taking on banks, you're taking on developers. And so in like responding to what I heard, and it's terrific stuff, the effort, and it's all in the right direction, but I'm wondering if we actually can have a sense of what we're up against without just saying screw it. And No, the other thing is that if we had a party, like something like the us versus them would be a tactic. It would be propaganda or something like that. But you still have to know, like, you are claiming to want to overthrow capitalism, and I'm not calling anybody here down, right? Like, this is not necessarily to the panelists here, but like, we're taking on this huge task of wanting it to get out of capitalism, and we don't even like account for just like we're on the street and the cops are on their horses, with their gear, and some of us have planned to be arrested, and okay, that's a like it just all seemed like mayhem to me, right? And it's all good and it's all better than being the man himself, the us versus them thing. But then, there's so many questions in that one idea of us versus them, What we might find out, and I'll end here because I'm sure I'm close to 2 minutes, is that the us will screw us around every time. Now the workers are Republican, something like that, right? Into 2022, the workers are voting Republican. Like, what the hell is that? Are they on our side? I don't think the left is claiming that.
It was actually slightly over 2 minutes. I'm just a really nice guy. And Brianna.
Dictatorship of him.
Benevolent.
Yeah. So yeah, I want to, first of all, respond to when I say we're not expecting to win, I meant specifically, just with regard to like the electoral campaign, we knew going in that like the chances of us defeating Eric Adams was incredibly low. I do not mean that we don't expect to win. We go into every we go into every other campaign, with the exception of some of these electoral campaigns, expecting to win. Well, I mean, as we build, we should absolutely go into electoral campaigns expecting to win too. But we understand the very nature of like the American electoral system is one of the least democratic in the world. So when we expect to win, what we expect to win, I'm thinking of those comrades in New York who actually stopped Amazon, for instance, from coming in and trying to build one of their major headquarters. I think it was in Queens or something, and they ran them the hell out of town. So yeah, that's the campaigns we expect to win. I just want to make that clarification because, we shouldn't go into these things with a defeatist attitude. We should absolutely expect to know what victory looks like for working class campaigns and for working class people. And then I want to also, I think this question of like without politics, stuff just happens. It's important. That's one of the things we're realizing we just started last night a campaign around Austin Energy, which is obscenely raising its rates on the lowest energy users, on basically raising its rates on the poor and lowering its rates on the rich. And people got these letters in the mail. What we're finding out is we're doing this outreach. People got the letters in the mail and they didn't expect that to be able to something that they could even vote or have a say on. And so what we told them was like, no, this is still up in the air. This is something that hasn't been voted on yet. This is something we can win. So the first step, I think, always to bringing people past this concept of stuff just happening to them, of just, Austin Energy sucks, which is something we got over and over and over again, is opening up that possibility that this is something we can change through class struggle. And so, I think the first step is always like presenting, I don't want to say smaller battles per se, but giving people these opportunities to engage in struggle, and through that struggle that transforms their consciousness of what is possible through further struggle. That's how you, I think, break people out of kind of the nihilism of everything getting worse all the time. You have to bring them into just the very idea that these things can be fought against and won, for sure.
All right. And now, the main event. We are going to open the floor to questions. If people would just like to raise their hand. And it appears as though Gabe from Platypus Austin is raising his hand and is ready for a question.
If you want to ask a question, why don't you just come on down, because it looks like the best way to get to the microphone is to come to it. So maybe people can form a line.
A line would be good, single file preferably.
Okay. I'm going to start with a short quote from American Socialist Party leader Eugene Debs. He says, it's very short. He He says, quote, "The Democratic and Republican Party represents the capitalist class and the class struggle. With either of these parties in power, one thing is clear. The capitalist class is in the saddle and the working class under the saddle," end quote. The left today would not agree with this sentiment, instead using fear-mongering rhetoric about Republicans as Nazis and fascists to justify supporting the Democrats. Why do you think the views of a party leader like Eugene Debs no longer hold currency with most leftists today?
Should go down the line.
Yeah, or whoever wants to hop in.
I mean, I'd love to if that's all right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I first want to I don't think we're talking about the left when we talk about those that are accusing fascists on the right. I think we're talking about the centrists in this country, maybe center-left if you're being generous. I think true leftists in the United States realize that fascism has many forms, and we are currently living in a fascist state. So the idea that we're going to join a current fascist ruling party to take down the next fascist ruling party is a little absurd. That's my opinion. I think Debs was right to just agree with you, and I think the left doesn't necessarily, in my opinion, the left that I've met and spoken to doesn't disagree with Debs.
Yeah, I mean, the Democrats had sort of a few moments where they were in a position to make concessions to working class struggles in the 1930s and the 1960s that truly had nothing to do with the politics of their party. So I think there's always that kind of illusion that we could go back to that party, but that wasn't really, the Democrats at that point weren't fighting for working class people, and they were a ruling class party making concessions to the working class. At a time when capitalism itself was very unstable. I don't think it actually hold as much currency as it does. I don't want to get into like a no true Scotsman argument. So like what constitutes the left and what doesn't. I think it's more important for us to understand like why so many people still believe the Democratic Party is somewhat, quote unquote better on some of these issues. And and I think we just need to so I lost my train of thought there, but I think generally there's been kind of such a lack of other alternatives, and I think there's no easy answers to how we present these other alternatives. Like the union movement is really strong right now. We had the huge rebellion against racism. These are all moments at which people start breaking away from this idea that the Democrats are the only choice. What I've noticed is that normally there's a huge uptick in people wanting to join leftist and socialist parties during Republican administrations when things are apparently really bad. But what I've noticed is even during Biden, people are still really interested in socialism, in Marxism, and in revolution right now. So I think that stranglehold is slowly being broken.
I don't know why, but I can tell you how. In a way, when I was a kid trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life, I found out that the bricklayers made pretty good money, and I'm like, how do you get to be a bricklayer? And they're like, join the union, but no one had a job as a bricklayer. This is mid-70s. And then Reagan busted the air traffic controllers in the 80s. And the whole issue of labor unions, I'm sure I can say labor unions, and no one here really they can think of a corrupt leadership first before they actually think of bare knuckle leftists who are out there ready to fight politically. That's just not my image of unions when I think about them, except from the 30s. And I told you I worked with a Republican for Congress, 25th District in 1998 and 2000, and I saw the Republicans in Deer Park and Pasadena and Baytown and LaPorte, Texas, the people who have the guns, and they're the LBJ Democrats, and they went Republican, and they now vote Republican, and they're workers, and they make $35, $40 an hour. I have students who make good money. I teach at a community college, they're freshmen, and they work for Exxon, and they intend to work for Exxon. So there's your benefits of the union, but way past, 40 years past, memory for me, because I never thought I'd get a good paying job through a union. So they still have it there. That's how. I mean, I don't, that's my response, Gabe, to your question.
If you'll indulge me, I'd like to ask 2 questions to each of the panelists.
Consider yourself indulged.
Thank you. This is for Pete. Seeing that the CPUSA calls itself a party, what are the responsibilities of the CPUSA in contemporary society?
Sure. I'll be honest, I don't want to speak for the entire party across the country because I am a Austin, Texas chapter member who's only been with the party for probably 5-6 months now, so I'm not going to speak for all of them, but I will say what I'm learning in Texas, it's part of education and communication with local people, tabling events like this, participating in events like this, going to union meetings at places like VIA 313 and other local spots that are looking to organize and educate the masses. And I think while we are a party, right now we are definitely more of an organization that is coming together and building a party rather than a representative party that currently has footing in electoral politics.
Thank you.
Sure.
And my next question is for Brianna. You mentioned that the role of current socialist groups, or perhaps even embryonic parties, is to collectivize people, to educate. So I just simply wanted to ask, what role would these embryonic parties play in the formation of a dictatorship of the proletariat?
I mean, yeah, in terms of this, like the post-revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat, and you're specifically kind of asking, like, after sort of day one after the revolution, like, what do we hope to accomplish through that?
Or even in its trajectory to get there?
Okay, or even how do we get there, per se? Yeah, I mean, I think at this point, a lot of it, there have been calls for years and years and years for a quote-unquote general strike. You see it on you see it on social media popping up every few months. I see like a sticker outside a coffee shop, general strike this date, general strike that date. But a general strike obviously requires a huge union density, and it requires like a level of discipline, not just among unionized workers, but among the entire population to be willing to support that. And of course, I'm thinking of like the Chicago teacher strike, I think it was about 10 years ago or so, really relied on a lot of outside support from like the family and the community. And so I think that's something that we need to, like, I think it was Lenin who had described unions as like the training grounds for working class struggle, the gym, so to speak, where we become like the swoletariat. Sorry. That joke fell a little flat.
I like it.
But yeah, so in an immediate sense, I think, unions is going to be a really important avenue of this struggle, being able to like hit capital where it hurts the most, and bringing workers into the sense that they have democratic control over their own workplaces is absolutely key. Obviously, this needs to be done. Like we need to, fundamentally, we look at who like has been the most rebellious over and over and over again against capitalist oppression. It's those people who have faced the harshest capitalist repression. So when we talk about like what we need as strategies to win, like understanding like Black national liberation is an absolutely key. Indigenous national liberation, those are absolutely key. So building the connections between the two, making unions happen, first of all, taking unions to like a higher level of like understanding of, beyond just the the quote unquote bread and butter issues, but making them also about things like, for instance, Google workers walking out over tech for apartheid and things like that, Israeli apartheid, and connecting those things is going to be really, really crucial. So when we talk about, what does a revolution look like? How do we get to that revolutionary period? Building a level of like internal worker discipline and worker resiliency is going to be important.
Thank you, Brianna. Pete.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
So I have one question for each panelist. So I'll just say them together, and then you guys can do them in whatever order. And thanks very much for all of your remarks. Okay, so my question for Pete, you challenged Michael's question about whether or not there is a proletariat today, and you said there is a proletariat, but our sense of being proletarian has been destroyed by individualism. So my question is, when do you think this happened, and how and why? And then my question for Michael. Okay, my question for Michael is, today I think there's kind of common sense that, politics is dirty. It's just a zero-sum interest group racketeering. And in that sense, it seems like zero-sum interest group racketeering, obviously that kind of politics would fall below the threshold of capital itself. So meaning it would fall below the kind of horizon of possibility that's presented by capital as the unconscious accumulation of social activity. So how is the politics of the working class supposed to rise above, like, the politics of an interest group racket? How does it actually go beyond or meet, at the very least, the threshold, the horizon of possibility of capital? Because politics in the zero-sum interest group sense is also just stuff that happens, right? And then my question for Brianna. So you started out your remarks by, noting how people's movements have been trying to challenge austerity globally. And some of these have been co-opted by the right. And I think, if I think on what you're referring to by people's movements, I feel like we've seen 2 decades of them, starting with the anti-war movement, then Occupy Wall Street, the Tea Party, the Trump movement, / the America First movement, Brexit, SYRIZA in Greece, the trucker convoy in Canada. Like, I feel like we've seen 20 years of this, and the shift I would sort of note is maybe a leftoid shift going towards what, I don't know, people on the left would certainly call a right-ish shift. So my question to you would be, like, why is that? Like, why is there very limited left leadership in these major people's movements globally, or even limited left support for these people's movements against austerity globally? Okay. Thank you.
I'll give them time to keep formulating. I've had all the time in the world, so I'll answer your question first. I think what I mean by the proletariat being destroyed, I don't think it's necessarily individualism that destroyed it, but it's usage by the neoliberal capitalist power in creating this murky, overpopulated petite bourgeois, right? We're all given this belief that by being a worker for a capitalist, we're a member of a higher class than others. And that separates us. That keeps us from finding that unity, where some of us make a little more than other people, have better benefits, can afford a second car, whatever. All of these were tools, I believe, to keep the proletariat from finding common ground. It separated us further than we already were by basic job status, and had found ways to, the clothes you wear, the home you buy, the properties you can afford on other lands, the bank account you have. I think all of those things kind of murked the pool into a petite bourgeois that doesn't realize they're actually proletarian.
Thanks, Bentai. I think that's a huge question. I'm humbled to try to answer it. So, in short, like, we're in a morass, and how can we aspire for more and better? And politically speaking, since there's maybe nothing really to choose from if it's all corrupt and below the standard of what we need, that's how I'm hearing the question. I'm sure there's different ways of taking it, but I guess like this, the simple answer is education. I try not to just like give obvious boilerplate answers. That's not engaging. Like I talked about waiting and preparing. That's like the point was that like Marx had some downtime right after the Communist Manifesto before some other thing he did, using him as a template because we kind of like what he did, right? So there's some downtime and stuff, and there's some organizing, and there's need to pause, and that to me always speaks for like let's get out there and be active, right? When there's nothing to be active with, and that's the corrupt parties. And then I also want to say that I have a friend who's an old leftist. I mean, he's nearing 80. He's out in California, and he's the real thing, right? from the 60s, and he just always reminds me to like relax a little bit. There's a lot of people out there, like I'm really into history and politics now because of Platypus, and there are people who've been struggling forever, and they're everywhere, and we can't imagine it, just like we can't imagine capital and the world in capital and how complicated it is with all the forces. Like there are people who are there, and maybe they're prepared, and I think Marx, like that, the Marxism teaches that it can happen in a blink, and it can happen with planning both. So if you think something might bubble up, the Gen Z might say, like, it's clear to us, like something's got to change. I mean, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but we have to know it could bubble up. Like Luxemburg says, it's like lightning strikes, and maybe she was talking in a different context, but I always like that image, right?
Yes, I think this question of co-optation by the right, the ultimate reason why the right appears, and I think there's a pretty illusory appeal to be quote unquote more successful, is because the far right has an incredible amount of funding and an incredible amount of media coverage. I'm thinking of just all of the major protests that have happened, over any number of subjects, and especially anti-war, anti-imperialist protests that get no coverage whatsoever, versus whenever they're, say like less than 100 people at, say, earlier on in the pandemic, the anti-vax protests, the trucker protests, whatever. These tend to be way smaller in numbers, and they get way more media coverage because there's a faction of the media that's aligns with the same faction of capital that's funding these, I think, relatively minor protests. I think we need to differentiate between people who may, who are working class people who may have internalized, like reactionary ideas that can be talked to and worked through, versus like the people who are actually leading this, the people who are actually spearheading these, because these are ultimately, this goes back to like the misdirection. They take this kind of like, resentment that people have toward things that are going on. It's often the resentment of like, sort of the struggling, quote unquote, like white middle class. I don't want to get too much into that, but it's like, it tends not to be those workers who are suffering the most, but it taps into a level of resentment that people have about the struggle, the struggles they're facing, and it misdirects them into, often like just scapegoating immigrants or other vulnerable people. And so, I think this question of like how we respond to that, understanding that like, that there's this difference between the people who are spearheading these things, the Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world, versus the like kind of people who might just be caught up in this or might be sitting at home and have internalized some of these ideas. Ultimately, there's no shortcut here. There's no, like, some people want to be able to, quote unquote, ally with the right, but like Marjorie Taylor Greene, for instance, clearly isn't like serious about, when she said defunding the FBI, and people have already forgotten about that. She's not interested at all. There's no game plan for the Republican Party to put that forward on a bill. They certainly don't give a damn about, like, if they actually cared about defunding the FBI, they would be calling to free Leonard Peltier, for instance, but they don't give a damn. So I think, like, ultimately, the only solution to that, and we need to be looking at creating our own media apparatuses. We need to really be challenging the kind of capitalist lockstep of media coverage of these things. So we need like strong professional, quote unquote professional looking media that engages people and brings people into like our side of the struggles. But yeah, ultimately there's no shortcut in terms of like the way the right is co-opting these things. Like we have to expose it as the absolute dead end that it is.
So my question is a response to something Michael said, but it's kind of open to what all of you have to say. So Michael, you said that you talked to your Gen Z son, and he said that he feels like he doesn't really have prospects, and that the only direction to go is to push the Democratic Party so far left that it becomes the Socialist Party. And well, of course, he doesn't speak for all of Gen Z. I think also in my experience of teaching that for left-wing students, this kind of does feel like a reality. However, in the lifetimes of any like 18 to 25-year-olds, this has never happened. In fact, the opposite has happened. I think you could look at, from Clinton to Obama to Biden, the Democratic Party seems to be moving more and more actually to the right, if you can think about it in that way. So I'm wondering if you could each speak to what you think accounts for that perspective from Gen Z when history has shown the opposite to be true.
Your question, I think you should start.
Thinking on my feet. That's fine. Whatever you want.
You want to start, Bree? Opposite it up? I feel bad going
Yeah.
first every time.
Oh yeah, no worries. I think. Yeah, I think from the I don't know. I feel like there are plenty of different directions within Gen Z. I think we also need to kind of break down like what it means that people are grouped into particular like generations and then kind of told what their politics are. Thinking of all the things like as a quote unquote millennial, I've been told that my politics have just been pretty insane. But yeah, I do think there are trends, and I think it is important that like there are still a lot of people in general, a lot of young people who like still want something out of the Democratic Party. They saw like the Bernie Sanders campaign just get destroyed twice. They saw the campaign just get stolen from him twice. And they still, like a lot of people broke from that, but a lot of people are still looking to that. And so I think just in terms of like, I think they're just going to expose themselves more and more over time. But I think we, as like an independent socialist organizer, we need to be like exposing through our own actions rather than just telling people. Like I could tell people all day long, the Democratic Party is not the answer, the Democrats are not the answer over and over. But if I'm not providing an alternative for people to look to of like, this is the battles we're fighting, this is what the working class struggle looks like to us, then I mean, people don't care what I have to say. And so I think ultimately we need to be, as socialist organizers, providing that for an actual alternative rather than just telling people this isn't the answer. And that will help, that will ultimately expose them more, I think.
It's who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes kind of question. And the fact is that we're believing them, really, the media. So I think there's a total media saturation. And like I was all about in the imperialist, the Iraqi war, we were anti-imperialist. W. Bush was a demon, and he was, like Chavez, you could smell the burning sulfur, the speech he gave at the UN. And, I was all on it. And then Trump became that. And so even now I find it tough to say like Trump is, like not the Antichrist, right? Because that's everywhere. It's saturated. Like everybody's NPR'd. My sister, who's roughly my age, my son, like they really can keep saying this because but like it's the current that we live in, right? It's the river that we swim in. This communication. And it's very complicated. I think of like the Democrats and Republicans on the Ukraine. Like, how are we supposed to sort that out when both are on the same side? Does that mean we're on the same? No, it's society with saying that, and we have to deal with like it's turtles all the way down, or it's like we are what we're communicating. That's what it is. And so, like, why do we keep getting the wool pulled over our eyes? Since and like, will the Gen Z be able to see that? And actually, like, I'll end with the anecdote. Like, I was talking to my son about this, asking him the question and what the Gen Zs want. And he actually was, like, responding in ways that were, like, where did you learn that, right? So he's the internet guy, right? He's the internet socialist, a Marxist or whatever. But he's sorting it out that way. And, again, maybe something will bubble or, like, something will strike with Gen Z. And what do they have to do? They can pick up like the radicalness from the 60s. Like what does that look like? We'd like to think it's something, but it's got to probably take a form that it already has, right? Like street protests or whatever.
Okay, so this is going to probably be the most long-winded thing I have to say. So before I go into my opinions on the Democrats and what I think they've done to socialism as a movement, I first want to just let everybody know that I'm not anti-electoral politics. I'm not anti-working with other groups. And I want to do that by quoting Lenin, one of the shorter quotes I've got here. But when speaking on left-wing communism, an infantile disorder, he actually said, "We must not regard what is obsolete to us as something obsolete to a class, to the masses." So to us, most of us in this room, electoral American neoliberal capitalist government and their electoralism is nonsense. We've all moved past it. We've read theory, we've seen action, we know better. But the masses might not. And it's important for us to remember that when we're talking about these movements that seem to be going nowhere. For a lot of people, this is going somewhere. And I think it's important to remember that and kind of step down from our pedestal when we're talking about these things. Now I'm going to get a little radical and say that I think the biggest problem we face, especially for Gen Z, is that the neoliberal elites, Democrats actually more than anyone, have co-opted socialism. I truly believe that while they're afraid of saying socialism, they've put people on their tickets in local races promoting socialism, only to then join the Democratic Party and do what the Democratic Party does. And that's a problem, right? We have real socialist movements. We have real socialist movements out there, but they're not getting coverage. They're not getting support from the Democrats. They're trying to help Democrats do something right. And I think that's where Gen Z, I think, needs to be given as much attention by us and others like us as possible to have a firmer grasp on what kind of system they're in and what kind of systems can be before they just inevitably fall into stuff happening around them and buying the neoliberal line that, oh yeah, these are socialist policies. Your roads get paved, that's socialism. That's the party line that I think to this day is still being used by Democrats. Oh, hey now.
Yeah. Thanks everybody for the great remarks. Really appreciate everything everybody had to say. So I think my question goes along the line of the previous question, so it ties in nicely. You know, one of the kind of reasons for putting on this panel at this time was the thought that, you know, the November midterms are upcoming and the anticipation that we're going to see some sort of repeat by the Democratic Party of, you know, trying to mobilize people into voting them back into office as is necessary. And so I'm really curious, you know, for all the panelists, you know, what can we do? Because I think we brought up the problem of co-optation by the Republicans, but what I feel like what we've seen in the recent past, and Bree, you brought this up as well, is really the co-optation by the Democrats, and how over and over we've kind of had the football taken out from in front of us, where we'll have the, you know, football of the Bernie Sanders campaign or the squad or, you know, whatever, what have you, as representing quote unquote socialism, and then, you know, this is going, like, what it really means is, well, you're going to vote for some Democrats again. So yeah, how do we deal with this problem? I think that's very immediate for the left. How do we deal with co-optation from the Democrats?
So I think there was an old quote from one of the Black liberation leaders of the 1960s. I want to say this is Kwame Ture, but I may be wrong here. Basically, what he had said was like, if the if the white man wants to lynch me, that's his problem. If he has the power to lynch me, that's my problem. And I sort of, not to take too much audacity here, but like, I think that's something that can be applied to a lot of different things. So it's like, if one of the capitalist parties wants to co-opt socialism, that's their problem. But if they have the power, if we just keep letting them do it over and over, pretending to be the populists and pretending to care about the workers' movements, then that's our problem. And so ultimately, I think I'll feed back into the other answer there is like, we need to be building these forms of struggle We need to be building trust among the community. We need to be building our own media networks that can rival sort of the not only professionalism, the journalism, the professionalism of the look of capitalist media, so that we have our own mass communications. We have our own messaging to the people. We have our own inroads into communities, so that, you know, again, like, we're not constantly just saying the Democrats are bad, the Democrats are bad, the Democrats are bad. We are building a platform that is independent of the Republicans or of the Democrats. We are working with communities to implement that, and we are, we are ultimately showing that there is a socialist way forward, and so that when the Democrats or the Republicans do try and co-opt these little bits of the workers' movement and say we're the people who really care about the working class, it's very obviously transparent, because people can look and say, well, you know, the PSL or the CPUSA, these have been the people in my community. So that's I think how we, you know, do that. And I think generally, like, midterms come and go. The thing is, with midterms as a co-optation, or with elections as a co-optation technique, they're not really that effective, because people vote, people pull the lever, and then it's over. And then there's nothing left. Either the Democrats win or they lose, but there's no long-term building of people back into the Democratic project. So I think, you know, if we kind of focus on, like, just keeping people not, you know, voting against the Democrats or whatever, or not voting for the Democrats, or not going back into the system for this or that midterm, it's kind of a road to nowhere. I think people will vote how they'll vote. I think there are perfectly understandable reasons why people might vote for various liberal candidates, you know, given, like, how terrible Abbott is. I get it. So I'm not worried too much about it. I don't think our messaging needs to be focusing too much on, like, preventing the Democrats from, co-opting. Our strategy is really just, like, we need to be building the socialist alternative outside of that.
Yeah. Okay. So I think there's a lot to unpack, and I think that's a great response from Ray. The grassroots I want to kind of focus on. Think about Chris Smalls, dude that helped Amazon start unionizing, a lot of press. But if you realize, he got that press after he organized. I think that's something that, while I agree with most of what Bree said, I will say that I think the idea of trying to combat capitalism with capitalism is something we're going to lose. We're never going to be a shiny. We're never going to have the same money. We're never going to fight them in that system with money and shiny. We're never going to be as shiny as those groups. That's me being a defeatist. However, I think where your successes lie are in that local area, that local arena. Like you said, being the parties that people say, well, they're the ones in my neighborhood that are talking to me and educating me and helping me. I think you start there. And to go back to Chris Smalls, I think what he did was he talked to the workers. He organized. He didn't look for a vanguard to speak for him. He didn't wait for the press to come to him. And that's just one example of a few modern day grassroots people that are showing you will get attention if you poke the big old bear. You might not win. I'm still not convinced that Amazon is going to go down because some groups are organizing. I think it's amazing. And I think it's important that the work is getting done to show progress before trying to combat the current powers that be in their own game. I don't think we win that game without numbers. And I don't think we get those numbers until we talk to the people. We need to do more organizing in the warehouses. We need to do more organizing in restaurants. We need to do more events like this where people can come off the street.
I'm sorry, can I
Please.
just quickly, just a follow-up thing, because I think that this is an important piece of this. So another important piece of this, I would say is, I feel like these are things that the left has engaged with before, and I think one of the things I didn't say explicitly in my last question is, what makes it different this time? Like, how can we say, because I think what we need to keep in mind, of course, is that the working people in this country, the working people around the world, are looking at this situation, and to the extent that the left is politically viable or not, they're going to say, okay, they seem to be doing something, or they don't seem to be doing anything, and maybe we can get a better deal with the Republicans or the populist right or whomever, or the Democrats. So I guess that would be something I'm very curious about, is, like, again, as we're facing the future, what makes it different now?
Sure. For me, I think what makes it different now can be. I don't think there's a huge difference now, personally. I think we're still in a transitionary period in this country where you saw the Dem exit, which is huge, right? It's a huge amount of people that realize that neoliberalism is bad no matter what costume it puts on. Big step in the right direction, getting people educated, getting them interested, and getting them to vote is important, but I believe Bree put this perfectly, was what happens after they vote, things just kind of move on. We need to make sure we're not letting that happen. I think that's the purpose of current left movements, because we're not going to be able to compete in capitalist electoral politics. It's not a game we're allowed into, right? We can participate in it. We can work with groups that have the power to help minimize damage and make things better for people. But if we really want to just gut it, it's going to take what happens after we vote. What happens after we've made the decision that wasn't necessarily the one we wanted to? What are we going to do to make sure the next time we have better decisions? And I think that's the trajectory I hope we're going on.
Yeah, I mean, I have several thoughts as to what makes things different now. We can go all the way, part of me is like, do I want to go all the way back to the 1980s for this? And sure, why not? Let's jump into this.
Just
so,
go.
Put my hair
So I think we need to understand the broader trajectory, because we talked about neoliberalism a lot. Neoliberalism fundamentally dates back to the 1980s, the Reagan era, but what really gave neoliberalism the drive that it had in the 1990s especially, ultimately I think was the fall of the Soviet Union. And there are certainly many, many valid critiques of the Soviet Union, but it was nonetheless it was a power block of working class elements. It was not a perfect power block. We can get into that whole history. But what ultimately happened was that the American empire was in serious crisis in the 1970s and 1980s. It was in many ways in a case similar to what we're about to be facing today of stagflation. So the economy there was ultimately falling apart. The American empire may not have lasted into the 1990s or into the 2000s if it had not been for something nobody saw coming, which is the fall of the Soviet Union and ultimately that influx of American capital into new markets. The wholesale selling off of the entire Soviet economy gave American imperialism kind of a new, it gave it a big boost. So that allowed for neoliberalism to, I think, thrive and for American imperialism to, really have this luster of being victorious that allowed it a few more decades. But ultimately, the same economic issues continue to face, the same jobless recoveries that were characteristic of the 1970s and 1980s have very much returned, where capitalism is in many ways at the end of its life cycle in terms of its ability to generate jobs again after a major economic, the economic boom and bust cycle. So we, have worsened along that path. At the same time, we've seen the switching off of various Democratic and Republican administrations that have ultimately, in many ways, just the changing face of the presidency has discredited both parties to such a degree. Obama came in sort of as the face of hope and change, did absolutely nothing. So that was the first time as tragedy. We get Trump, who comes in and just visibly wrecks the sort of imagery of American imperialism. But then we get Biden come in, whose message is not hope and change. His message is literally, I am not Donald Trump. And so it was the first as tragedy, second as farce. And I think we're at that point now where, given that we're seeing such economic devastation of so many communities, given that we've seen so many false recoveries since 2008 and even before that, we are in a different situation where what would have held water as something that's a change from the system is no longer holding water to people. The material realities of people are really running into the ideology that the ruling class is putting forward.
Bernie Sanders 2015 socialism, right? And became a word we could speak. And then I was actually with the CPUSA phone banking in Houston, and what came out of that loss was the phrase "our revolution." And I believe it was our understanding in Houston that's where the Bernie energy was going. And I have not heard a thing I don't even know that anybody knows about our revolution.
Can I just reply to Brie? Because I actually really loved part of what you were talking about with the material conditions and the current crisis. But I'd like to just kind of mention in the manifesto, and especially in Capital, Marx brings up crisis as a function of capitalism. Right? Crisis is necessary in order for capitalism to continue to work as a system. So while I see all of the contradictions that you're bringing up, I'm a little less enthused by them, because contradiction is what keeps capitalism afoot. And this is cyclical. Like we see this happen every 7-8 years, like clockwork. 2008.
Yeah.
Like these things, we saw economic collapse, tons. My question, and this wasn't more of an argument, it's more of a question for you. Let's say the economic collapse happens. Let's say that we lose everything. The banks are screwed. The big corporate economies are gone. What's next? Let's just say that you're right and that the economy is going to collapse. What do we do next? I'm sorry I cut into your question. I was just...
No worries. I think that's actually really important, and I think it's going to be a question that those who are involved in like union organizing at like Starbucks or Amazon right now need to be thinking about for sure. I think so. There is kind of a qualitative difference in like what Marx was talking about. At that period in capitalism's history, where it was still like the monopoly development stage versus the development of imperialism, and ultimately after imperialism, capitalism has been able to remain stable because it's had expanding markets. Without expanding markets, the economic collapses or the economic shrinkages, I don't want to like imply a complete collapse, because the British Empire, despite having nothing left, has continued to like just shrink over decades and decades. So it's not going to be a wholesale collapse, like just everything goes at once. But understanding that like the intensity of recessions get worse, the frequency of recessions get worse over time in a way that wasn't the case when capitalism was still like sort of surging in the monopoly stage and then in imperialism. So there's a qualitative difference there. As far as what we do, and I point people to Sam Marcy's book, High Tech, Low Pay, which was written in the 1980s or so as sort of an early attempt to qualify what was changing qualitatively as opposed to earlier periods of imperialism. In terms of what we do, I mean, I think, it's going to require a change of strategies. Yeah, you're absolutely right. The Fed is specifically, I know you didn't mention this, but the Fed is specifically attempting to induce a recession. At the moment, it is all likelihood going to succeed because nobody's able to stop them. And so we need to be thinking about other strategies, like, for instance, unemployed councils. Like, how do we then... we need to be looking at stopping evictions, et cetera. We need to be challenging the right of capital to evict people from their homes in times of their most desperate crisis, the right of capital to turn off electricity on people. One of our demands since the winter storm has been like no utility shutoffs for people who are unable to pay, and things like that take care of people who have been ejected and thrown into the reserve army of quote unquote reserve army of labor during this period. So yeah, there's no easy answer, but I think there are strategies we can shift to for sure.
Thank you for the book recommendation.
Just a pretty simple question, more for definitions, directed mainly for Bree, but if any of the other panelists want to join in. How would you differentiate class struggle and participating in bourgeois democracy? Your example of Austin raising the energy prices for the poor and lowering for the rich specifically comes to mind in your presentation earlier, and what you were just talking about as well. So. Yeah.
So I think with class struggle, it is any form of... I mean, class struggle can take many, many different forms, but I mean, I see class struggle as something that's really about bringing workers together to demand things that may not appear as immediately demandable in many ways. So something that you're told you can't possibly vote on, or something like canceling student loan debt, We're told it's just a complete impossibility. There's no practical way to do it. It doesn't exist. It needs to be an act of Congress, et cetera, et cetera. Well, class struggle then, it doesn't always have to take this form, but class struggle then steps in and says, no, this is absolutely possible. We need to make these demands here and now. We need to we need to be more organized so that they will see that there are consequences, beyond simply getting quote unquote voted out or whatever the case is. So class struggle is anything, in my mind, that brings together different elements of working or oppressed people, to raise their consciousness level and to show them that victories are possible, inside or outside of the system. I think participating in bourgeois democracy can take a couple different forms. Like we can fight for kind of reforms where it's like, none of us are trying to get elected to city council so that we can, cast a protest vote against Austin Energy raising its rates or whatever. But we are nonetheless, we're demanding a reform within the system that immediately helps people. I generally think of participating in bourgeois democracy as more running political campaigns. Kathy Rojas in New York, Gloria Riva for president. And I think, when Lenin's talking about, participating in bourgeois democracy, he's talking about that in the context of a revolutionary Marxist party running their own candidates, for reasons other than what the Second International did, for instance, which was they honestly kind of believed that they could seize power and seize the capitalist state from within. So what Lenin sees as participating in bourgeois democracy is running political candidates. If you do happen to win those elections, it's not a matter of reforming that capitalist state from within. It's about using that platform you have from within the capitalist state or from within the capitalist elected civilian government to agitate and to to inherently expose the contradictions within that system and inherently expose the oppression of that system. So I've been talking a little bit. If you want any further clarification, I'm glad to provide that, but I think that's a general good answer.
You got something?
No.
Sure, I'd like to talk about this a little bit. While I didn't prepare an intro, I prepared some answers to potential questions, and thank you for hitting it. I'd like to just, quote Lenin one more time, just to make his thoughts hopefully clear, from the same piece, Communism and Vile Disorder. Capitalism could have been declared, and with full justice, to be historically obsolete, in quotes, many decades ago, but that does not at all remove the need for a very long and very persistent struggle on the basis of capitalism. And I think it's important that we remember this is Lenin telling us we're going to have to get rid of it. We're going to have to work in a way that allows us to kind of infiltrate and understand it and not just say, doesn't work for me. And I think that's where our need to participate in bourgeois electoralism is super important. And just one more little bit here. I think, I'm going to quote Stalin here. Forgive me if you have opinions. But he was speaking on universal elections in 1937 when he won re-election. And he said, universal elections exist and are also held in some capitalist countries, so-called democratic countries. But in what atmosphere are elections held there? In an atmosphere of class conflicts, in an atmosphere of class enmity, in an atmosphere of pressure brought to bear on the electors by the capitalists, landlords, bankers, and other capitalist sharks, such elections, even if they are universal, equal, secret, and direct, cannot be altogether called free and altogether democratic elections. Here in the Soviet Union, on the contrary, elections are held in an entirely different atmosphere. Here there are no capitalists. There are no landlords, and consequently no pressure is exerted by propertied classes on non-propertied classes. Here elections are held in an atmosphere of collaboration between the workers, the peasants, and the intelligentsia, in an atmosphere of mutual confidence between them, in an atmosphere, I would say, of mutual friendship, because there are no capitalists in our country, no landlords, no exploitation, and nobody, in fact, to bring pressure to bear on people in order to distort their will. And I think these are lessons we can take on how to hold elections, how to have parties representative of people within what you would call, Marxist-Leninism is democratic centralism, what you would call democratic, but at the same time not looking anything like what our corporate electoral system looks like now. And I think there are ways for us to switch that up in the current system, just in participation and follow through, as opposed to voting and walking away.
You guys talk a lot about organizing, like Bree, that was your whole thing. And I was just wondering, like, with like so much of the proletariat like being inoculated against the term like socialism, do you think like when we appeal rhetorically to them, like, do you think we need like a rebranding? Do you think we might even need to abandon the term socialism? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
I think in recent years especially, the term socialism is so much less scary to people. And I think we do ourselves a disservice of assuming that, the working class is too afraid of socialism to, accept that. I think, in terms of how do we approach people, like, I think I generally haven't sort of had that issue going door to door. Certainly there are people who are just not socialists, they're never going to be socialists, and that's fine. They might agree with us on campaign and be involved in that, or they might not, but it tends not to be as big a deal as it was, say, a decade ago, or especially 2 decades ago and beyond, like in the 90s, 2000s. I think there are absolutely times where it's necessary to form like broader coalitions, or to form, a quote unquote front group. That is a group with like a limited sort of coalition building practice that allows us to, like work on a certain issue with people who might agree with our politics but not call themselves socialist. But I don't think we should necessarily like hide our politics, and I don't think we should necessarily be willing to abandon the term socialism unless it's been shown to us that people are so against it that like we can't possibly organize under it. I think now is absolutely the time where we need to be talking about socialism. We need to be fighting back against this ruling class propaganda about socialism, and that requires having some hard conversations with people. But those hard conversations are actually absolutely necessary in sort of formulating a demand that is truly socialist and in changing people's consciousness, for sure.
I think even if you change the name, the ruling class is going to find a way to turn you into socialism. I think if you show that your ideas are socialist and that you care about people over profit, ultimately they're going to find a way to link you to the evils of socialism out there, whether it's the DPRK now, or you want to go back to the evil Stalin. They're going to find a way to tie you to those movements, even if you try to be clever with it. Bernie tried to be clever with it. They turned him into a socialist. Bernie Sanders is not a socialist, y'all. Bernie Sanders was a democratic socialist. Bernie Sanders believed in American democracy and changing it from within in that system. He had great ideas. He was the most progressive Democrat I've ever seen in my lifetime. But the idea that he was like this Stalin-loving, communist-leaning socialist, that's all propaganda, like Bree brought up. And they're going to do that no matter what. So personally, I think changing terms or trying to gussy it up at all is ultimately just going to lose to the same propagandists. So let's be upfront with it, and let's educate people with fact over presentation.
Great question. I mean, I had that same thing about proletariat. It's silly to use the word proletariat, I think, in my life, just doesn't, it just means propaganda to people's ears, right? So branding, I will say that socialism is an historical term. Like, you can tell I'm big into history. Like, you go back, it surfaced around the same time capital did. You can't dismiss the idea. Now, if it's a tactic for a political party to shy away from socialism, it's a advertising campaign, I guess, would be my response. Yeah.
Thank you.
So for our last three questioners, since we're running out on time, we're going to have everybody ask all of their questions kind of at once, pass the mic down, and then everybody can kind of answer each one so as to be expedient with our remaining minutes.
chat with anybody after, by the way.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Speaking of Bernie Sanders, I had a friend who was really active in the Bernie campaign, and then recognized that everything that he wanted through the Bernie campaign, might as well just get it through the Democrats, right? So if we want things like stronger unions, if we want working people and oppressed people, working together and networking, community help, those can easily be turned into NGOs. If we want, anti-racism, if we want, anti-colonialism, these are all things that, that are kind of like the seed bed of democracy. So I guess so my question is, what is the goal of socialism that distinguishes it from, let's just say, national democracy, and whether that be the Democratic Party in the U.S. or just across the world. Democracy is about taking up all of these things, and whether unionization or anti-racism or anti-oppression, and just trying to so what is the goal of socialism that distinguishes it from that? And then connected with that, how does this goal of socialism relate to capitalism? And I just have one specific example there, just in terms of just to kind of pose the question and the problem. So if we work to make sure that Amazon doesn't build a warehouse in our district, then that just means that some people don't have jobs, right? It's the Joan Roberts thing, that the only thing worse than being exploited by a capitalist is not being exploited by a capitalist. So how does the goal of socialism come out of the problem of capitalism? Yeah.
Hey, I have a question for all three panelists. So for all political parties out there, right, be it American or international, historical or present, elected or otherwise, what do you see as one paragon, or blueprint for emancipatory politics? So in other words, I'm asking you to give a more concrete sense of what's the kind of alternative that makes the most sense to you, and yeah, thank you.
All right. This is a little bit unrelated, but I'll kind of open it up to a broader question. But I was wondering, I know that PSL, so this is directed to Bree, but I'm going to open it up to the rest of the panelists. I know that PSL tried to organize an Austin chapter in 2019 to some or a few consistent interruptions from RGA or Gonzalo White Mouse affiliated groups. So following their dissolution, or at least their public dissolution, has it cleared the way, in a sense, for PSL and other organizations to form in Austin? And has this been something addressed internally? To open this up a little bit further also, I would also, I guess as a general question, what would be then also the answer, or the implication within the answer to this question, of how do we confront the history of and subsequent failure of the sectarian left? For those who say that we have the answers and that no other answers that other parties or other organizations can provide, how do we address those failures as well when it's kind of this delivery of, it's no one else, it's only us, but even when it's only us, we still can't deliver on our promises. Thank you.
Folks, we love our Austin Maoists, don't we?
That's gonna be a fun one to answer too.
I mean, as far as I'm concerned, you can start there if you want, since it's fresh mind.
Yeah, let's fuck this pig. Nice. Sorry.
It's gonna be a doozy.
Yeah, I guess I shouldn't use the very vulgar colloquialism, let's fuck this pig, with people who literally put pigs' heads and all that. Anyway, so yeah, it was a 2018 incident. I think RGA actually I don't want to get too deep into this because this is all stupid. This is all just fucking stupid. I don't want to get too, but it was actually 2018 that a lot of this transpired. I think RGA started the rumor that we had quote unquote disbanded in 2019. We were so afraid of RGA, we fled the scene. I've been here since 2017. I didn't go anywhere. The comrades who were with us at the time didn't go anywhere. We were we were a small group at the time. I think we were like 3 comrades. Like none of us went anywhere. We just weren't very large to begin with, and they picked us as a target because that we weren't very large. Is more or less how that played out. So this idea that like PSL disbanded, PSL Austin disbanded is ridiculous. No, we actually continued organizing events through 2018, 2019. We had major protests in 2020. Like we've been here since 2017. We are not going anywhere. I mean, I think we need to, I think we need to look at the history of COINTELPRO. I think people need to read through those documents. I can't claim to have done a huge study on that, but I think people need to recognize that much of the hyper-sectarianism, much of the kind of hyper-violence and the need to disrupt and destroy in that, guys, is absolutely part of like the legacy of COINTELPRO. And so I think understanding that and understanding that like when you start looking at leftist groups, quote unquote leftist groups, or groups who call themselves leftist, who are just hyper focused on attacking basically trying to throw every bit of slander at people within the left. I think that needs to be called out. That needs to be immediately recognized as not a productive tactic. I think what we had basically said at the time was like, if they're not on the payroll, if they're not on the payroll of the capitalist state, then they should be, because of the actions that they undertook. Ultimately, the legacy of that is obviously just, I think, like a level of distrust I've seen within the past couple of years. Like, I think there's finally like a level of trust building within the Austin left that has been missing for some time. I hope that continues. I hope that while people might have differences, while we might have disagree on tactics, disagree on strategies, that we can continue to build coalitions with each other in productive ways, and understand the difference between an antagonism, or a contradiction that's ultimately an antagonistic contradiction, where ultimately these we stand for totally different things, which is very, very rare, versus a contradiction that's just we have different perspectives on something. And so I think ultimately we need to kind of have better level of trust with each other. We need to know each other better is important. We need to as far as how we defend against that, and ultimately this is just true of how a socialist party defends itself. The best way to defend yourself is have the support of the people behind you, have the support of entire communities, so that when somebody's attacked, the whole community truly rallies to the defense of this or that group, and they've built up those connections and whatnot. That's kind of how we had to do it with when we had comrades who were attacked by the who were rounded up and arrested in Denver after the 2020 protests. Some of them were the police in Denver sent a tank to one comrade's door and things like that. It was a very brutal arrest that was designed to send a message. But what we were able to do out of that, we rallied the entire country. We rallied comrades across the country. We rallied our allies across the country to drop the charges, because they were planning on trying to put those comrades away for decades and decades and decades. We rallied to those comrades' defense. We were organized about it. We were disciplined about it. And all of those charges were dropped. So it is absolutely possible to weather that kind of state intervention, whether it disguises itself as the left, or whether it's just pure right-wing direct state reactionary intervention. So that's my general thoughts on that. I'm very glad that period of organizing in Austin is over, because I know it wasn't just us who struggled with it. I guess I can provide some other thoughts, and then we can.
Do you mind if I bounce off what you just said?
Oh yeah.
I just want to talk more about unity and not having this sectarian, especially here in Austin, but just all over the country and all over the world. We're CPUSA is an international group. We're very focused on camaraderie, and if you read the works of Marx and other socialist and communist leaders, it's about building a mass. We are outnumbered already. And if we're now further splintering ourselves while already being outnumbered, we're never going to stand a chance. We can have different opinions on messaging. We can have different opinions on, the exact candidate we think we're going to support for the progressive thing we want. But I think as long as we're keeping the conversation open and we're not antagonistic for the sake of being antagonistic, I think a lot of good can come from that. And I hope Bree's right and that period is over and greener pastures are around that corner.
I would just like to say that we have 3 minutes left. Just want to let you all know ahead of time.
Do you want to take that or another one and just start up?
Are there closing remarks?
Looks like
Should we leave time for that?
The answers were supposed to be closing.
All right.
Yeah, I would like for us to get to these other questions too, which I think are frankly a little bit more important and relevant.
Can we tack on like 5 minutes? Cool. I've gotten approval to tack on 5 minutes.
I'll wrap up what I have to say then, in addressing the three questions that we had from different questioners. So like Clint is asking, to me, what I hear is if the HR is behind issues that are radical socialist demands, the kinds of training that we have to do at work, might be considered radical, what I'm saying? Do I need to spell it out? In other words, the isms, right? The HR department already makes me, as an employee, be cool with equal opportunities and so on, and the DEI stuff, not to disparage it, I'm all for it, right? But if that's radicalism, and the HR department's already doing it, then cool, good. The lawyers are at it, and they're gonna make a better world. So that would be that reply. The issue of emancipation and splintering, I think really it's like respect and, it just looks like not, what was my note? Relationships, right? We're in relationships. So I guess that's sort of Marxian, right? Like we're in social relations. We're not feudal anymore, and we're not answering to the lord of the manor. Maybe to the capitalists, that's a different discussion. But we are together here talking it out, and there's lots of differences. And, we want to go in a certain direction, and no one's really in control. Socialists are not in control. So you see what I'm getting at with emancipation and the last question about sectarianism and division. You just got to let it go. Let it. I guess if your ox is gored, you know what that phrase means? It's like you're a farmer and you have a neighbor farmer, and your neighbor farmer's ox gets gored, gets killed. Well, you're kind of sad for him, but it's not your ox, and you're happy it's not your ox. So if I'm not melting down, as a member of Platypus, let's say, if we're not melting down, I'm good, and I'm good to be patient and listen and, not be judgmental and respect other people and communicate. It's all good. Now, if my ox is gored, that's just when it gets tough.
Did you want to finish with your stuff or you want me to?
Yeah, I can go ahead and finish with my general thoughts. So yeah, this question of how is socialism different than just like a national democracy or bourgeois democracy? The difference there is, what is it you have democracy in? Do you have democracy to vote for somebody? Do you have democracy to have like an official different figurehead? Or do you have democracy in your workplace? Do you have democracy in your apartment complex where you live? Do you have democracy on like what changes get made to your community that affect you both, local, regional, and national levels? And then does is the state that sits at the top of that, is the socialist state, or is the state like encouraging that democracy? Is it trying to work with the tenant unions and trying to encourage that level of democracy, or is it trying to crush it? And so what a socialist democracy looks like that's different fundamentally than a capitalist like bourgeois democracy, or a social democratic like capitalist quote unquote welfare state. The difference there is ultimately like who has the say in who is controlling, quote unquote, the means of production, who is controlling capital, who has the democracy of the workplace, who has the democracy in terms of like who's deciding how the resources of society get used. I don't like to use too specific, as far as like I was asked the question of the blueprint. What is the blueprint? I don't think there can be a single blueprint, because obviously each country has different struggles, each country has different legacies, etc. It would be like fundamentally to me like anti-Marxist to say like this particular country is a blueprint for all other countries to follow. But I think if I had to look at one example that I think exemplifies what is possible, what is truly democratic, I would look at Cuba today. Cuba is setting democratic precedents, and I would look at the way they did their family code is a perfect example of this. Cuba just redid their family code. It was portrayed in American capitalist media as quote-unquote legalizing gay marriage. The truth is it was so much more expansive than that. They are truly rethinking how it is they define their family, to include LGBTQ people, to include all sorts of like non-traditional family structures. And so they didn't just impose that upon the population. They didn't simply say, we're more progressive than you, we know we're right, we're going to vote on this. They brought this in terms of tens of thousands of meetings across the country where they're talking to people in their communities. They're explaining to the people directly, this is why we're putting forward this, this agenda. How do you feel about it? This is our rationale behind it, but how do you feel? And so they rewrote the family code before they even submitted it for a vote. I think something like 49% of it was rewritten based on their conversations with the people, but it was still a huge progressive step forward. Based on that, it just had the buy-in of the people now, and so then they resubmitted it for a vote, and it passed with overwhelming approval. So that's how we move forward. That is what democracy looks like. We don't have anything like that within this country, and so to me, like, again, not using Cuba as the only example, but truly as like sort of one possible avenue we can look at as far as like what a socialist democracy could look like.
Cuba's a great example. I think that concrete alternative that we're talking about, that blueprint, I think Bree's absolutely right. It differs per your region and per your circumstance when a revolution occurs. For instance, if you look at your aggressive people's revolutions, fighting in the streets, collapse. Cuba's a great example of taking a country that was literally falling apart under Western influence and taking it back. That's incredible. However, we can look at more. I'm gonna use the word social democracy to describe people like Lula right now, who's running in Brazil. Lula's a great candidate compared to Bolsonaro, but that's like comparing Joe Biden to Trump. Everybody was obviously going to say, well, we're going to be better off. Lula's made a lot of agreements with global nationalist corporations and Western powers to make sure that Brazil competes in a global market, and in doing so is contradictory to a lot of socialist principles. However, his circumstances in taking power and bringing the proletariat to the forefront were very different than whether we look at Castro in Cuba or Chavez in Venezuela. These are just different forms of revolution, which I think is a further discussion point to talk about sectarianism and how the left keeps dividing itself. We need to be accepting that revolution occurs in all different shapes and forms. It has, and it will continue to. And if all we do is stick to our guns and say nothing else is right but mine, we're ultimately going to fail, in my opinion. And then finally, just real quick, Clint, I believe, right, Clint? You talked about Amazon losing jobs for people. Those jobs pay nothing. They require forced overtime and people to pee in bottles because they can't get a break to go to the restroom. Cameras in their cars if they're drivers. They're not being stripped of anything. The state and hopefully representatives of the people are stepping in and saying that those working conditions aren't good enough. And we're not going to be happy with you creating jobs for us to then go toil away at for a pittance. And to also follow up and just say, oh, that was the right thing to do, then it is a socialist government's responsibility to create alternative jobs in lieu of what is considered lost. And I think that's where a lot of Democrats fail, is they say, look, we did the good thing, but there's no follow through of, well, what did the good thing do for everyone? What are we going to continue to do from that good thing? They just say, oh yeah, we legalized, well, we got a couple people out of jail for weed, but we did nothing to systemically get the prison population in private prisons reduced in any meaningful way. We still haven't changed any actual laws. So it's very symbolic in democracy, whereas socialism is required by the people that put them in power to show tangible evidence. I'll use China as an example. They've got a 5-year plan, and she is held accountable for that 5-year plan every term. Now, whether you agree or not that she's fulfilling it from here, whether you're in China and disagree or not, that's your right. However, at the end of the day, that is a form of government that, at least on its face, is saying we listen to the people, here's what we're going to do for the next 5 years, and can then, in some way, be held accountable for that.
Is it though?
I said on its face. We can argue all day about what media you read, what media I read, how much time you've spent in one place and I've spent another. But at the end of the day, I'm talking on its face. The concept of the Chinese Communist Party is, in essence, to listen to people, present what they're going to do, which none of our leaders have ever done. They're actually going to say, this is what I'm going to, not, I promise I'll try to get this done. I promise I'll try to get that done. Objective goals that have to be met or be held accountable for. Now again, whether or not the people feel fully represented, I can't speak for China. I can't. I'm not there. I'm not a Chinese person, and I'm also not millions and billions of people. I can't be. So I'm giving you my example of what I see happening in their politic. And I'm seeing every term, I'm seeing people speaking up for themselves, and then them being held accountable to follow through with their 5-year plan. Like she has proven that he's hit his points. Like you can argue specifics about the way the Communist Party functions over there, but I'm specifically talking about the way that they run on an election and are held accountable for the things that they claim they're going to do. And we don't do that in a democracy in the United States. Joe Biden was going to cure cancer. His term's almost up. I don't think cancer is going to be gone.
Well, she is supposed to make COVID disappear. At least that's what he said.
Well, the train is pulling into the station. I think this.
Let's compare numbers later.
Before this becomes fucking interminable, this marks the conclusion of the Platypus Political Parties in the Left conference. I would like to thank all of our panelists. If we can get a round of applause there. I would also like to apologize for the non-presence of Coleman Schollard. He was unable to make it, our representative from the YDSA, as he was mauled by a Yeti on the way here. We're going to have a 1-hour break until our next panel, which is Family? Family in the Left at 3 p.m., same place. Thank you all.
Teeth drawn on it, some red for blood dripping out of the side.